is Jake, back again with clearly better production value, and today I'm going to be talking about the Small Faces 1968 album, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake. I don't have the album cover to obnoxiously shove in your face for the entire video like last time, but I think this will make do. Now, I got into the Small Faces around the beginning of quarantine. A very good friend of mine is a big fan of the whole British invasion mod scene, and he's kind enough to show me this band that he got into also around this time. The Small Faces are, as we both like to call it, his quarantine band. Mine was the Grateful Dead, his was the Small Faces. For those of you who don't know who the Small Faces are, or have a very limited knowledge of them, they are an English rock band formed kind of at the peak of the British invasion scene. They were pretty big in Britain. They had songs like Itchy Coo Park, Tin Soldier, All or Nothing that kept them on the charts. The only problem is their management. Now, I won't go too big into detail on that. It's typical bad management stuff. But if you want to know why the Small Faces never made it big in America, that's why. The band consisted of Steve Marriott on guitar and lead vocals, Ian McLagan on keyboards, Ronnie Lane on bass, and Kenny Jones on drums. Now, Marriott actually went on to form Humble Pie with Peter Frampton, a band that I like. They have their moments, certainly, rocking the Fillmore, but they never ever captured that essence of the Small Faces. And Kenny Jones went on to be the drummer for The Who after Keith Moon passed away, and he recorded my favorite So Bad It's Good album of all time, Face Dances. And I always thought of Kenny Jones as like, oh, he was the drummer after Keith Moon died. Thankfully, upon discovering the Small Faces, I was dead wrong. Now, most of you also may know that the Small Faces went on to become the Faces after Steve Marriott left with Humble Pie. And who stepped in? My main man, Rod Stewart, and Ron Wood helped out on guitar. The Faces, again, good bands. I can see why they're respected and loved in the world of rock. And I get it completely. Again, never ever even touch the Small Faces, for me at least. And I'm gonna praise the Small Faces some more because frankly I don't think they get enough. They were a band like no other in the British invasion. Frankly, I'm surprised as to why they're not as popular as the Rolling Stones or the Beatles even. They were a band where, much like The Who, each member was their own powerhouse. Steve Marriott was a 1 5-foot man show, hence the band name. His stage presence was just magnetic. He was just this big ball of energy holding this white Gretsch Falcon that looked way too big for his body. Now, I'm sort of an amateur bass player myself, so I will hype up Ronnie Lane, who is an above amateur bass player, any chance I get. He has his own unique style. You know, you see him in performances just kind of plonking the bass, but it works so well. It's fantastic. And Ian McLagan, very, very tasteful keyboardist. He doesn't go super, but he knows when to strike. He knows what to play, when to play it, and why to play it. He is the master of taste. And I know I already talked about Kenny Jones, but I don't think he can be talked about enough. His playing with the Small Faces, some of the best drumming that I've ever heard. Now, onto the album. Ogden's Nut Gone Flake was released on April 24th, 1968. It was the Small Faces' last studio album up to that point. They reunited in 1977 for Playmates, and then 78 in the Shade in Now, I think a lot of Small Faces fans share my sentiments on this. It's fine. It sounds like Humble Pie B-sides. And I'm pretty sure most of that has to deal with the departure of Ronnie Lane, who apparently, from what I've heard, just walked out the first day of the reunion. And it really is a shame because when him and Steve worked, they worked. And I believe they were actually recording another studio album after Ogden's by the name of 1862. I could be wrong on that, but that is what I believe it was to be called. But these sessions fell apart due to infighting between Marriott and Lane. Man, these guys just not like each other. Anywho, now when the Small Faces started recording this album, I would assume tensions and emotions were already a little high because they had just come off an Australian tour with The Who that was, by pretty much all accounts, a disaster. The shows apparently just sucked. I mean, the very few Small Faces performances that have been released have been fantastic from what I've seen. So it's kind of hard for me to think of the Small Faces and The Who during that era being bad in any regard, but I wasn't there. I can't say. The main problem with that tour, however, was the local press that constantly mocked and hounded them as soon as they got off the plane. The one great thing that did come out of those sessions, those early sessions, that any of us have yet to hear, was apparently the Small Faces did a cover of Be My Baby by the Ronettes. Now this cover is said to be lost. I don't believe it. Kenny Jones was recently just talking about wanting to release, a bunch of Small Faces related stuff. Kenny, if you're watching this, I'm sorry for what I said about The Who, and the Faces for that matter. Please drop this cover. Also, keep that Who tour in mind. I'm gonna briefly come back to it in a little bit. Now, on to the songs. Track 1, Ogden's Nut Gone Flake, the title track. Now this song is essentially a heavier, more psychedelic reworking of their second single, I Got Mine, which was, I guess, kind of a flop during that time. I can't really say why. I think it's a good song. Definitely not up to par with the other stuff that they've released. And I'm glad they reworked it into something that I personally think is better, because this is a beautiful instrumental opener to this album. Now, a lot of you, I'm sure, know it from Grand Theft Auto 5. It was in the trailer, and it's on the Los Santos rock station, if I'm not mistaken. Funny thing is, it's one of my all-time favorite games, but I never really picked up on that song until I got into the Small Faces. Also, fun fact for all of the Man from U.N.C.L.E. fans that are watching this song has a string section that was orchestrated by David McCallum Sr., who is the Man from U.N.C.L.E. star David McCallum's father. I thought that was interesting. Track 2, Afterglow. Hands down, best song on the album. I think most people would agree it's not even a competition. The song was written for Steve Marriott's wife, Jenny Rylance, and it was also played at their wedding along with, I believe, Tin Soldier, which was also written about her. Some say this song was the original power ballad. I get it. I could see why you would think that. It does have the very, sweet, happy, pretty, romantic verses, and that booming, loud, powerful chorus. But it's just, the song seems so much better than that. I just cannot put this song in the power ballad category due to its quality. It's just that good. Also, about earlier, how Ian McLagan knows when to strike. That keyboard dirt right at the beginning of the chorus. It's one of the greatest songs ever. Let's just call it what it is. It's one of the greatest songs ever written. Track 3, Long Ago's and Worlds Apart. This is another shining McLagan moment, one right after the other. His voice, I really like his voice. Even with all the very psychedelic, spacey effects it has on it, it still sounds very, very good. I also really like Up the Wooden Hills to Bedfordshire, which is another song that Ian McLagan wrote and sang on one of their previous albums. I don't know. I think he's really underrated, both as a singer and a songwriter. He didn't have the technicality of Marriott, but it worked just fine. This is just an all-around fantastic psychedelic rock track. It has a beautifully nostalgic vibe, similar to The Autumn Stone, which is the last song they recorded together. Probably top 3 Small Faces songs. It is beautiful. Track 4, Renee. I love Marriott's Cockney accent on this one, and he also delivers one of his best guitar moments at the end of this song. That's the other thing. Steve Marriott was an extremely underrated guitar player. Maybe one of the best rhythm players of all time. That much I can say. And I'm gonna say it again. McLagan is rocking it. Also, I was kind of hesitant on saying this, but I couldn't help but think it. The lyrics and the arrangements and Marriott's line delivery kind of give it and I swear I didn't get this from TikTok, a sort of sea shanty vibe that I love. Track 5, Song of a Baker. Favorite Marriott riff of all time. Oh my gosh! Also reminds me that Ronnie Lane is incredibly underrated as a songwriter and as a vocalist. My favorite vocal performance of him is later on this album, but still. In addition to having the best riff, Marriott has the best solo on this one too. I gotta hand it to him. This is definitely also the rockiest song on this album. If you want an example of the Small Faces being a great rock band, this is the song on this album to go to. This is definitely a psychedelic album through and through. I wouldn't call it acid rock, but it's definitely trippy. That song, however, proves otherwise. Track 6, Lazy Sunday. This is the Cockney song. I love it. Marriott's Cockney accent on this song was apparently inspired by an argument he had with the Hollies, who accused him, "Hey, you're not singing in your own accent, guy." And Marriott was all like, "Lord forgive me. Oh, you really think I'm not? I promise you never have to watch that again." And the song itself was pretty much inspired by a feud that Marriott was having with his neighbors who weren't fans of the noise next door. Now keep in mind, in addition to being a rock and roller, Marriott was still sort of a rowdy youth at heart. He was 18 when the Small Faces formed, and he was 21 by the time they released their last album. And apparently the rest of the band disapproved of it being released as a single, which kind of baffles me considering it's a fantastic song, but to each their own. Side 2. This is where things get interesting. So side 2 of this album is like a mini rock opera, basically. It's a story about a boy named Happiness Stan, named after, I believe, Ronnie Lane's brother. And Stan has a very interesting dilemma. He sees the moon during one of its half phases. And instead of thinking, oh, yeah, you know, the moon, going through its phases, as usual, he thinks the other half of the moon is gone. He thinks it went off somewhere, someone stole it, I don't know. He wants to find it. This very wubbulous tale came about when Ronnie Lane was on the Small Faces boat trip after the Who's Australian tour, which I previously mentioned, and he was looking up at the moon, and he noticed that half of it was missing. And Steve Marriott he took that sort of idea, and he came up with the rest of the story, which I'll explain starting now. So side 2 opens up with the song Happiness Stan, and it basically just kind of exists to introduce the character of Happiness Stan and the plot of the whole story. One thing I forgot to mention is that this story is narrated by Stanley Unwin, who narrates it in his own kind of style of English language he calls Unwinese, which it's like you get the general gist of what he's saying, but at the same time you kind of have to use context clues. And this sort of mini rock opera is very interesting in the fact that most of the story is told through narration. I like to think that, the Small Faces and actually the Pretty Things with S.F. Sorrow, they sort of pioneered the idea of the rock opera, and The Who just perfected it. The song Happiness Stan is another one of the songs on the album that has a very psychedelic feel to it. And one thing I noticed when listening to this album is that the Small Faces really did psychedelia better than most. This is, they were known more in the early days for their bluesy R&B style, but when they ventured into psychedelia around this time, like most bands did, they were up there with the best of them. Track 8, Rollin' Over. This is definitely the bluesiest song on the album. It's the main song that's reminiscent of the Small Faces' earlier work. There's really not a lot else to say about this one. It mainly serves as a transition song, kind of, just kind of further the plot along. It is what it is. Probably my least favorite on the album, but it's good. Number 9, The Hungry Intruder. This one's underrated. So basically, at this point in the story, Stan stops for a lunch break, pretty much, and he encounters a starving fly. And he decides, out of the goodness of his heart, which is the only reason anyone would feed a fly, really, to feed the fly. Despite that really odd concept, this is a beautiful song. Ronnie Lane, aside from maybe Green Circles, has never, ever sounded better. His voice on this is soaringly beautiful. And Steve Marriott as well. Him and Ronnie share vocal duties on this one, and Steve's great as usual. Track number 10, The Journey. So basically, the fly is very grateful for Stan's generosity. He's like, hey, how can I pay you back? And Stan's like, you know someone who knows about this moon business? Because I'm struggling, bro. And Fly's like, I don't really know myself, but I got someone. The keyboards on this one are really, and the drums are very sort of groovy. Mainly the keyboards, but it's really the rhythm section. And Ronnie, of course, is on fire. And the outro, the breakdown in the middle to the outro, basically it's one big thing, but it's maybe my favorite Small Faces outro. That and The Autumn Stone. Track 11, one of my personal favorites on the album, Mad John. This song introduces the character of, well, and many people are afraid of this Mad John. Probably because he's different. He's not very, doesn't fit in, really. They're like, oh, stay away. Kids, stay away from this guy. When actually, he is a pure, loving soul who knows not only what's up with this moon, but also the meaning of life. That just took a turn. This is definitely one of my favorite Steve Marriott vocal performances. I know it wouldn't be considered one of his best, but it's one of my favorites for sure. Something about his line delivery on this is he's very subdued in this, I noticed, but it just works beautifully. 12th and final track, Happy Days, Toy Town. So John greets Stan, and he's like, hey, you still worried about the moon? And Stan's like, yeah, I'm still worried about the moon. And John's like, boy, do I got a treat for you. He takes Stan outside and shows him that the moon is full once more. And in true Monty Python fashion, decides to sing a song about none other than the meaning of life, which, according to him, is a bull of all bran. I think he knows something we don't. This is a very upbeat, jovial, sort of almost goofy way to end the album, but it's so heartwarming almost, and it's very pure. It's just, there's nothing harmful about this song. Nothing really innately wrong. It's just a perfect way to close this one out. Overall, this is definitely the Small Faces' defining work. I love their early stuff, their early R&B, blues, pop stuff. It's all fantastic, all worth checking out. Please, please indulge yourself in this band. You will not regret a thing. Also, I will talk about or review or whatever anything music or movie related on this channel. I am not canceling out any genre or artist or filmic, anything like that. If it is music related, I will review it or talk about it. If it is movie related, I will talk about it or review it. Just if you have anything that you are for some reason interested in hearing my thoughts on, please do not hesitate to ask. Any recommendations, requests, etc. are all welcome here. So I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got a little bit of insight on this album and this band. So, yeah. This is Jake. I'll be back.